The first time I saw Susan Lund, she was crouched in the corner of a padded cell at Ridgeview Psychiatric Hospital, her fingernails scratching invisible patterns into the walls, and every nurse on the floor refused to go near her. They called her the terror of Wing C, a woman so volatile that orderlies had quit mid-shift rather than face her rage. But when I looked into her eyes, I didn't see a monster. I saw a woman drowning in a pain so deep that terror was the only language she had left. My name is Dr. Maya Chen, and I was a second-year psychiatry resident when Susan Lund became my patient. That was 7 years ago, and I still think about her every single day, not because of the screaming or the violence or the way she once threw a metal tray so hard it left a dent in the concrete wall, but because of what happened on the night everything changed. Let me start at the beginning, because Susan's story is not what you think. It is not a horror story, though it wears the mask of one. It is a story about what happens when love becomes grief, and grief becomes silence, and silence becomes something that looks like madness to everyone who refuses to listen. Susan Lund was 63 years old when she was admitted to Ridgeview under emergency detention. The police had found her wandering barefoot along Interstate 5 in the pouring rain, wearing nothing but a nightgown and clutching a tarnished silver locket that she refused to let anyone touch. When an officer tried to take it from her, she bit him, hard enough to draw blood. When they wrestled her into the squad car, she screamed for 3 hours straight. The booking report described her as unpredictably violent and a danger to herself and others. But here's the thing no one tells you about cases like Susan Lund: the terrifying ones are almost never born from evil. They are born from breaking points. They are born from the moment a human being suffers so much that their mind folds in on itself like a paper boat in a hurricane. I learned that lesson the hard way. My first interaction with Susan lasted exactly 12 seconds. I walked into her room with a clipboard and a practice smile, ready to conduct my intake evaluation. She was sitting on her bed, knees drawn to her chest, rocking slightly. Her grey hair hung in matted ropes around a face that might have been gentle once, high cheekbones, soft eyes that now held nothing but static. I opened my mouth to say hello, and she launched herself off the bed with a shriek that rattled the window panes. I don't remember much after that, except the feeling of her fingernails raking across my forearm and the sound of alarms blaring as the crisis team rushed in. 4 orderlies pinned her down. She fought them like a wild animal. And when they finally sedated her, she whispered something that made my blood run cold, not because it was scary, but because it was heartbreaking. "Leo," she said. "Leo, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Then her eyes rolled back, and she was gone. The attending physician, Dr. Harrison, pulled me aside afterward and suggested I request a different patient. "Susan Lund is a lost cause," he said, tapping her chart with a pen. 37 years of practice, and I've never seen a case this severe. She's been in and out of facilities for over a decade. Assault charges. Restraining orders. Her own daughter won't speak to her. Some people can't be saved, Chen. You need to learn that before it destroys you. I almost listened to him. I almost walked away. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing her voice, not the shrieking, but the whisper. "Leo, I'm sorry." There was something in those words that didn't fit the narrative of a violent psychopath. There was grief in them. There was love. So I did what any young, foolish, stubborn resident would do. I pulled Susan Lund's file and started reading. What I found changed everything I believed about mental illness, about compassion, and about the stories we tell ourselves to explain away the people who scare us. Susan Lund had not always been the terror of Wing C. 30 years earlier, she had been Susan Kolsky, a first-grade teacher from a small town in Oregon. Her students adored her. Her colleagues described her as the kindest person I've ever met, the woman who stayed after school to help struggling readers, who bought winter coats for kids whose families couldn't afford them, who once donated a kidney to a stranger she met at a church bake sale. Yes, you read that correctly. Susan Lund gave a kidney to a complete stranger. That was the kind of person she was. She met Leo Lund when she was 28. He was a carpenter with calloused hands and a laugh that filled entire rooms. They married after 6 months, had a daughter named Grace, and for 15 years, they built what everyone who knew them called a fairy tale life. Leo built her a garden shed with a stained glass window. Susan read bedtime stories in 3 different voices. Grace learned to ride a bike on the driveway while her parents cheered from the porch. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in July, Leo went to the hardware store to buy paint for the nursery. Susan was 4 months pregnant with their second child and never came home. A drunk driver ran a red light at 60 miles per hour. Leo died instantly. The paramedics said he probably never felt a thing. Susan felt everything. She felt it so deeply that it rewired her brain, synapse by agonizing synapse. She finished the pregnancy alone. She held her newborn son, Daniel, in her arms while Grace watched from the doorway with eyes that had aged a decade in 3 months. For a while, Susan held it together, or appeared to. She went through the motions: bottles and diapers, school drop-offs and parent-teacher conferences, grocery lists and laundry. But inside, something was crumbling. The grief didn't come in waves. It came as a permanent, unrelenting fog that turned the world gray and muffled every sound except the memory of Leo's voice. The breaking point came 2 years later. Daniel was learning to walk, and one afternoon he stumbled on the garden path and fell face-first into the rose bushes. It was a minor injury, a few scratches, a little blood, but Susan's reaction was anything but minor. She screamed. She scooped him up and ran inside and locked all the doors and windows and sat in the corner of the living room, rocking back and forth, convinced that someone was trying to take her children. The police arrived to find her barricaded in the bathroom with both kids, convinced that the neighbors were part of a conspiracy to kidnap them. That was the first hospitalization. There would be 12 more over the next decade. The diagnosis changed every time: postpartum psychosis, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, complex PTSD, borderline personality disorder. Different doctors, different labels, but the same underlying truth: Susan Lund was a woman whose mind had shattered under the weight of a loss she could not process. She saw threats everywhere because the most unimaginable threat had already happened. She had already lost the person she loved most in the world. Her brain had decided that the only way to survive was to assume that another loss was always coming. She pushed Grace away first. Teenagers are not known for their patience, and Grace had her own grief to carry: grief for the father she lost and the mother who was disappearing piece by piece. At 17, Grace moved in with her grandparents and never looked back. She changed her last name. She told her college friends that her parents were dead. It was easier that way, she later explained. Less painful. Daniel held on longer. He was only 2 when Susan first broke, so he never really knew the mother she had been. He knew the mother who checked the lock 17 times before bed, who followed him to school at a distance, who once called the police because he was 10 minutes late coming home from a friend's house. He loved her, but love has its limits. At 22, Daniel moved to Seattle and changed his phone number. He sent a letter that said, "Mom, I can't fix you. I'm sorry." After that, Susan was alone. Really, truly alone. The locket she was clutching when the police found her? It contained a photograph of Leo on one side and a lock of his hair on the other. She had worn it every day for 30 years. It was the last thing she had left. For the first 3 weeks of her hospitalization, I made no progress. None. Every time I entered her room, she either ignored me completely or attacked me with whatever object was within reach. I have scars on my left hand from the time she grabbed my pen and stabbed me with it. I have a chipped tooth from the time she headbutted me during a therapy session. My colleagues thought I was insane for continuing to try. My supervisor scheduled an intervention to discuss my concerning attachment to a hopeless case. But I noticed something they didn't. I noticed that Susan never attacked me when I came in quietly. I noticed that she stopped screaming when I sat on the floor instead of standing over her. I noticed that her eyes followed my hands when I held them out, palms up, empty, a gesture that meant I have nothing to hurt you with. I noticed that she responded to music. It was an accident, really. One afternoon, I was sitting outside her door, updating her chart on my tablet, when a song drifted through the hallway from the recreation room. Someone was playing classical piano on the speakers. It was Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece I'd heard 100 times but never really listened to. Susan's door was slightly ajar, and I saw her freeze. Her hands, which had been tearing strips from a bedsheet, went still. Her head tilted. For the first time since I'd met her, Her face softened. She started to cry. Not the violent, thrashing sobs I'd seen before, but quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks and dripped onto her hospital gown. She reached up and touched her locket. "Leo played this for me," she whispered. "On our first anniversary. He learned it just for me." It was the first complete sentence she had spoken in 6 months. That moment changed everything. Not because Susan suddenly got better, she didn't. But because I finally understood what I was dealing with. Susan Lund wasn't a monster. She wasn't even crazy, not in the way people meant it. She was trapped. The music had built a bridge between her present terror and her past love, and for 30 seconds, she had crossed it. I went to my supervisor the next day and asked for permission to try music therapy. He laughed. "She's not going to play the kumbaya drums, Chen. She's going to throw them at your head." "Then let her throw them," I said. "At least she'll be interacting." He gave me 2 weeks. I brought a small keyboard into her room, the kind a child might use for lessons, with plastic keys and a tinny sound. I set it on the floor, 5 feet away from where Susan sat rocking on her bed. Then I sat down on the opposite side of the room and started playing. I am not a musician. I took piano lessons for 3 years as a child and remember exactly 2 songs, Chopsticks and the theme from The Muppet Show. So I played Chopsticks. Badly. It was humiliating. But I kept playing, because every few notes, Susan's rocking would slow down. Her eyes would flick toward the keyboard. Her hands would twitch. On the 3rd day, she crawled off the bed and sat across from me. She didn't say anything. She just watched my fingers stumble over the keys. On the 5th day, she reached out and touched the keyboard. Her fingers, those same fingers that had clawed at my arms, that had gripped metal trays and thrown chairs, rested lightly on the keys. She pressed one. Then another. A chord. A melody that I didn't recognize but that made my heart ache. She was playing. Not well, her hands shook, and her timing was off, but she was playing. And as she played, tears streamed down her face, and she began to hum. It was a lullaby. A simple, sweet lullaby that she must have sung to her children 1,000 times. "Leo built a cradle," she whispered, still playing. "For the baby. He was going to paint it yellow." I didn't say anything. I just listened. Over the next several weeks, a miracle occurred, not the kind where a person is suddenly cured, but the quieter kind where a person remembers that they are still a person. Susan started talking. Not much at first, fragments, half-sentences, words that seemed to come from somewhere deep and wounded. But she talked. She told me about the garden she and Leo had planted, the tomatoes that grew as big as her fist, the way he'd lift her onto the kitchen counter and kiss her forehead. She told me about Grace's first steps and Daniel's first word, Dada, of course, and the night she'd held Leo's hand in the hospital after his appendix burst, promising him that she'd never leave him. She told me about the guilt. The terrible, crushing guilt that she hadn't been able to save him, that she hadn't answered his last phone call because she'd been grading papers, that she'd wasted so much time on things that didn't matter when every second with him was precious. The guilt had turned into paranoia. If she couldn't protect Leo, she had to protect everyone else, had to control everything, had to keep her children so close that nothing could ever take them. Except that pushing them away was the one thing she'd done that she could never undo. "The last time I saw Grace," she said one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper, she was 16. "She told me she hated me. And I told her I hated me too." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen before, clarity. In that moment, Susan Lund was completely present. She knew exactly where she was, exactly what she had done, exactly what she had lost. "I'm not crazy," she said. "I'm just broken." I reached across the keyboard and took her hand. She didn't pull away. "No," I said. "You're not broken. You're hurt. There's a difference." The unexpected turn came when I decided to contact Grace. I knew it was a risk. I knew Grace had every right to refuse, to hang up the phone, to tell me to go to hell. But I also knew that Susan's recovery, fragile as it was, would never be complete without some form of reconciliation. Not for Susan's sake alone, but for Grace's too. Because the terrifying truth about families torn apart by mental illness is that everyone suffers. Everyone carries scars. And sometimes, the only way to heal is to face the person who gave them to you. Grace lived in Portland now. She was 38, married, with 2 children of her own, a boy and a girl whose names she had chosen carefully, Leo and Susanna. When I called her, she was silent for a long time. I could hear her breathing, could hear the weight of 30 years pressing down on the line. She tried to kill herself, Grace finally said. Twice. I found her the first time. I was 12. I know, I said. She called me names you wouldn't believe. She told me I was the reason Dad died. She told me she wished I'd never been born. I know. She scared me, Dr. Chen. She terrified me. I spent my whole childhood being terrified of my own mother. I waited. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is let someone speak their pain into existence. Then Grace said something I will never forget. But I also remember the way she used to braid my hair. Every morning before school. French braids, with little ribbons at the ends. She'd sing that lullaby, the one about the cradle. I haven't let anyone braid my hair since she left. There was a long pause. Does she still have the locket? Yes, I said. She's never taken it off. Grace started to cry. I thought she'd forgotten us. I thought she'd forgotten everything good. She hasn't forgotten, I said. She just couldn't find her way back. But I think she's trying now. And I think she needs you to help her remember. 3 weeks later, Grace walked into Susan's room at Ridgeview. I had prepared Susan for the visit, not fully, because you can never fully prepare someone for something like this, but enough that she wasn't caught off guard. She had showered. She had let me brush her hair. She was wearing clean clothes and holding her locket like a lifeline. When the door opened, Susan looked up. For a moment, neither of them moved. Grace stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth, tears already falling. She looked so much like Leo, the same eyes, the same way of standing with her weight on one hip, that Susan gasped. "Hi, Mom," Grace said. Her voice cracked on the second word. Susan didn't answer. She couldn't. Her whole body was trembling, and her mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. I saw the fear rising in her eyes, the old terror, the instinct to scream or run or attack. Her hands clenched into fists. But then Grace did something extraordinary. She walked across the room, slowly, carefully, and knelt in front of her mother. She reached out and took Susan's clenched fists in her own hands. And she began to sing. It was the lullaby. The one about the cradle. The one Susan had hummed while playing the keyboard. Susan's fists unclenched. Her shoulders sagged. And then, in a voice that sounded like it was being pulled from the bottom of a very deep well, she sang back. They sang together, mother and daughter, their voices weaving around each other like 2 strands of a braid. When the song ended, Grace pulled Susan into her arms, and Susan, the woman they called the Terror of Wing C, buried her face in her daughter's shoulder and sobbed like a child. "I'm sorry," Susan whispered. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." "I know, Mom," Grace said. "I know. I'm here now." That was 7 years ago. Susan Lund is not cured. There is no cure for the kind of trauma she endured, just as there is no cure for grief. But she is no longer terrified, and she is no longer terrifying. She lives in a small assisted living facility near Grace's home in Portland. She has a garden, tomatoes, just like she and Leo used to grow. Her grandchildren visit every Sunday, and she braids her granddaughter's hair and sings the lullaby. She still has the locket. She still cries sometimes. But she also laughs. Grace and I still talk. She told me once that the hardest thing she ever did was walk through that door. But she also told me that the bravest thing she ever did was stay. As for me, I learned something that no textbook could have taught me. I learned that the word terrifying is almost always a mask for something else, for grief, for fear, for a pain so immense that it has no other way to express itself. I learned that compassion is not about fixing people. It is about sitting with them in the dark, holding their hands, and waiting for the music to start. And I learned that every single one of us, even the ones who seem lost beyond all hope, is just a melody away from being found. So if you take nothing else from the terrifying case of Susan Lund, take this. The people who scare you the most are often the ones who need you the most. And sometimes, the smallest act of kindness, a song, a touch, a willingness to stay when everyone else has walked away, can build a bridge across the widest ocean of pain. Be that bridge for someone. You never know whose life you might save. Because Susan Lund taught me that no one is a lost cause. Not really. We are all just waiting for someone to hear our song.